Hello, and welcome to another session of the Game Mechanics. Today, we're talking about level design and environmental storytelling, and I'm super excited to have Chris Rogers here to join us on the subject. I had the privilege of working with Chris, for almost 12 or 13 years on a couple different projects, starting back at Smith and Tinker on, the name of the project. Nanivore, thank you. Oh my God, it's so old and remembering too many projects that are downstream. Anyway, and then most importantly at Harebrained Screams. There's a
We're making a horror game now, so it works.
We should have done that. Harebrained Screams would have been great. It would have been a great horror game. God, Harebrained Schemes, where Chris worked initially as an art director on several projects, and then became game director for the biggest game and really the most impressive game I think we ever produced, which was Lamplighters League. So it's a subject that he knows a great deal about, and I'm excited to have you to talk about. Thank you, Chris.
So glad to be here, Jordan. Thanks for reaching out.
Well, let's dive right in. So our focus here is mostly on narrative games. And so in the context of narrative games, the environments, the levels, everything from a document you present to somebody on a screen to how a conversation unfolds, the environments they're in, is all part of that storytelling. Step back and talk to me a little bit about how you kind of visualize that, how you think about the different ways that non-text, non-verbal storytelling takes place in a game.
Yeah, so everything starts off with text, but I think it's really important, depending on if there is going to be space in your game, and I guess there's space even if you're using text because you're describing a room by room adventure, to start kind of getting a sense pretty quickly in engine about how much space you're going to need. Too much space and the player's lost and they're kind of bored. Too little space, it might feel confined, which might be right for your game, but might be just knowing that amount of space. How many paces is it to this point? How many rooms are there, and that kind of a thing. So usually what we do is start in Miro and kind of lay things out just with gray boxes when we're working with space, because our games do have that kind of space, and that's been really helpful. But I've also seen people use simple narrative tools to sort of chain things together.
Yeah, and I think your initial point there is really important, right? Which is the environment itself, right? And environment can take very, very different meaning, right? As you said, it could be just something painted with words. It could be a top-down map. It can be an isometric environment. It could be a full 3D environment. But it doesn't exist to exist. It exists to feature the play mechanics that take place in it, right?
Yes.
So your space design and your mechanic design are very connected.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, I think as you're making this, and when you're thinking about environmental storytelling, I always feel like there's some stuff that the player needs to know. Like they cannot progress without knowing where the key is, or knowing where the locked door is and knowing that they go together. There's some stuff that you might want the player to know, but you're okay with them missing. And then there's some stuff that's just there to sort of help build the texture and make you feel immersed in the world, and knowing where you're at on that line, because sometimes you can get super excited about the texture and things, and you can kind of hide the key in too many words, or hide the key in too many props, and that way you're kind of letting the thing that adds to the experience kind of take away from the experience, because can't find my key.
I love that, and it's such a key thing, right? Because we do get really wrapped up in how beautiful it looks, or how dangerous it looks, or whatever the emotion is that you're trying to capture. And if you haven't kept a firm grasp on what is that visual priority, right? Like you said, mission-oriented stuff, you better be able to understand that, because otherwise the player can't advance, right? And then being able to have that mission-oriented stuff, and then story and lore-oriented stuff, and then kind of emotional cues, right? And being able to create a kind of a clear hierarchy of those things is super important.
Yeah.
And you can apply different techniques to get those things to pop out, right? To be able to create that. Any touchstones that you look at for how you can help with that kind of visual priority in anything from a 2D scene to a isometric or a 3D scene?
Yeah. So as players, we are both like one of the things that was really a huge advantage that you can have as a professional game player or a professional game maker is you get to see people playtest your game, and it's mystifying and it's frustrating and it's amazing, because what you see is what you then see in yourself later on, is that we are both like incredibly smart as players. Like we can cotton on to so many things that are going on in a scene, whether that's text or 3D environment, but we can also just miss incredibly obvious things. And so you can be there as somebody watching somebody playtest your game and just watch them basically tripping over the key they need over and over and over again. And you're just going, please, it's right there. Please, please.
How can you not see that? How can you not see that?
And then you can see them like walk into a puzzle and just be like, oh, this is based on like one of Fermi's theorems. And it's always mystifying because players are even within an individual can be like super smart, and like also like just you cannot lead them to the water enough. So it's where playtesting really helps. But I would just say anything that's important for the player to say, I would start off making it really, really obvious, and maybe even so obvious to you that it feels a little heavy-handed, and then you can kind of dial it back if it's in playtesting. It doesn't feel like it's enough of a puzzle, because even just putting the key in a different place than the door starts friction for the player to have to engage their mind. And if you hide it in a bookshelf, or if you put it someplace like that the player's really going to have to search, you could end up with players that are frustrated. And so I would start with the things that you need. You go ahead and put a big spotlight on them. If you have a light, make the text bold, like start big, and then see if that's the type of game you're making. Now, I think we should probably caveat all of this with like, there's always exceptions, and there's always unusual game goals that are outside of the norm, where breaking this rule is important for the overall feeling. But there's a pressure to explore, and there's time to think about things. But if you're in mortal danger, like you really don't have time to go back and check whether or not this part of the puzzle was what you remember, or if you took the note wrong or something like that, because you're too focused on other goals. And so like being able to signal to the player, like this is a section where you're going to be thinking, not a section where you're in danger. And you can play with that a little bit if you're in like a horror setting, or in a setting where it's like you should not feel safe. But in a lot of settings, I think it's really important for the player to have those kind of, the space can teach the player how they're supposed to experience it. And so giving the player a place that's quiet when it's time to solve a puzzle or it's time to think things through, and giving them clues about how, and again, this really comes down to the type of game you're making, but sort of giving them the boundaries of the puzzle. I think sometimes if the solution is further forward or further backward than the player thinks it should be, that can lead to a lot of friction, because of like, if I'm in a library and there's a locked box on the center table, I'm assuming that the answer is somewhere among the books or a hidden key, or there's something in there. But if it's something from an hour before, that's going to be tough. It's going to require some very careful players, and it's going to cause a lot of friction. You might have some people bounce off. The key word for me is hierarchy. Like, the player needs to know where this rates in the hierarchy, because if you put in that, we've been in a library for a little bit, so we can stay in a library for a moment. And just if in that library book you put like something very strange, like 3 eggs, 2 birds, and a horn, like the player's going to be like, okay, that's important information. I need to know that. That doesn't make sense. So it must be part of a solution. But if it's just something you put in there, they'll have false priors. So how can you say this is important information? It's a great feeling in the game when you find the thing that is important, right? When you come into a room, I think about text-based adventures that I did growing up, and so many things, it's like, we can't interact with that. I don't know what you mean. And then something goes like, you move the statue and it says like on the back of the statue is a note, and you're just like, yes, that is progress. That is something like that gives me something to go on. And it feels so good. And those games were very good. Those old text-based adventures were very good about saying like, that's not it. That's not it. That's not it.
Right.
put put hat on statue. And it's like, no. Like, but when you find it, it feels so good. And so really signaling to the player too, I think, those steps along the way to the final solution, especially in a puzzle-based situation, which we've kind of moved into. I guess that's not the only type of environmental storytelling, but in a puzzle situation, like even knowing that I found a piece, I found a clue, is really helpful to the player and builds up their good feelings and makes them feel like they're having successes.
Chris, I want to pick up on something we were talking about a little bit before. We were talking about kind of visually signaling the player the idea of safer spaces and more dangerous spaces. But I think there's a larger context to that, which is overall the kind of flow and pacing of environments and the story flow and action flow that goes with them. In music or in film, where you have complete directorial control, you can really craft those arcs, right? Craft the excitement and the denouement and so on. In a video game, you don't have as much control, but you still do have some to help with that. You want to maybe touch on some of that? I think you did a brilliant job on a lot of that in Lamplighters leagues. So good to touch.
Yeah. Well, I can talk about an early mission in Lamplighters that we were working on, which was a tutorial, and it's a tutorial for a turn-based tactical game with real time. So we have a lot to teach the player, and a lot of that went through basically setting up things for the player, knowing what the player needed to know, and then really trying to show the player lots of things that they might want to know, but that we were okay with missing. So within the context of the game, the characters are trying to make their way to a rendezvous, and they are surprised to find out that the enemy has gotten there ahead of them. And so now they have to make their way to the rendezvous around enemies. And one of the first things that we wanted to teach the player was how to hide in grass. Because if you hide in tall grass, you're not discoverable. And so it was tricky because we wanted to set things up for the player to feel very free, but to give them a real incentive to go towards the grass. So the way the map was set up, the grass was off to the side. We put guards in front. It was otherwise felt like you're going to have to fight, and it felt like it was going to be too much. But then we also dropped a little piece of a pickup, like a little lore piece that was like it would highlight the UI as you got close to it. So as you started to come closer to this place where there's a bunch of guards, you'd also get this little thing that says, this is this little interactable spot. Why don't you come over here and check this out? And it said something about the enemy's kind of overall philosophy, but it wasn't important the information of it was only important to us because it gave us a little bit of texture. But what it was functioning as was to draw us away from trying to have a big fight with the guards up ahead. And then there was grass, and you could see that it was very clearly like the guards had not done a good job of setting up their patrols and everything, because that space was very safe. And when you go in there, contextually, we could teach you like, hey, this is grass, you can hide here. We had you hide on the grass. And then we had guards, as guards in pulp movies tend to do. We're all standing next to a bunch of crates of dynamite, sitting in oil. They're standing there with oil, and that was your payoff, right? And I think to your question about pacing was like, we were really teaching the player within the context of the game, this is a good time to sneak. This is a great time to choose to go loud, to go big. And so, and all of those were cues, right? And the art team did a really good job. There's another layer on top of that, which is like, because we have this like sort of lush 3D engine, we had all sorts of lighting in place to sort of like try to pull the player in that direction. We had the oil slicks would catch the light of the lights as you swung the camera around. And it was all in service of trying to get the player to do that particular set of things. And most players did. Like every once in a while, a player would just pick a fight. But most players sort of felt that pull towards the side to use the grass and escape and pick an advantageous time to fight.
In Lamplighters, two of the key concepts, the verbs we were using was quiet and loud, right? And you had quiet parts and you had loud parts. And really, that's exactly what pacing is, right? That idea of being able to have two different kinds of modes so that you don't have, it isn't monotone, right? It's like, it has to ebb and flow. You have to be able to craft the excitement, the emotional response, the action, you don't want it to just be flat. It's like, it's balls out all the time.
Yeah, yeah.
That actually is flat, right? It gets monotone.
Exactly.
And so you want to be able to, and I think that's one of the things you identified and crafted really well into that game was that sense of quiet and then loud and how the two are connected. And I think touches on the larger kind of context of environmental storytelling techniques. One of the things that I think Lamplighters did well, we did even back in Shadowrun, I think we did reasonably well, but boy, we can do so much better now, which is having the environment really be reactive, right, to the player's actions, right? Have the you come in and you've got a scene that's set in one particular way, and even if you don't blow up the scene, right? If you've just been having conversations with people and over the course of time, that environment changes in reactions to your conversations. Like you're riling people up for a revolution, and all of a sudden you didn't put posters up and graffiti up on the walls, but others, because of the thing you're doing, because of your actions, you see the environment change. So I think let's talk a little bit about kind of just techniques of environmental storytelling and where opportunities exist.
When I think about like interactive environments, like I think the master class on this, which is no longer playable because it's been removed from all the stores, is PT, which is Kojima's like trailer for an upcoming horror game that never got made. And the environment itself is an L-shaped hallway with a couple of doors off of it, but it repeats. So every time you walk through the environment changes. And so the door is locked, the door is unlocked, the lighting changes. There's audio cues like a radio announcer that's telling you things about what has happened that changes languages and then because it is a horror game, things get progressively more, they get dark, they get dangerous, like you start getting chased, but every step of the way it's the same environment, and your job as a player is to notice those changes in the environment to sort of help progress the loop. And so the loop doesn't progress until you figure out what you're supposed to either see or do. But that is a case of the environment always reacting to you and changing, and the feeling of dread that you start to get when you start a new loop and you open the door and the lights are out now is just like it's so amazing. It's really something special. So like if you're looking for something where how do you do a lot with a little, it's still 3D and first person, but like how do you take a small environment and keep bringing new context, keep showing the player that they have an influence on this world. What they do changes things. It's very cool.
Yeah, that's an awesome example. And I love it because it is so small, right? And if you think about it, right, you've only got so much paint to spread. And so you can try to do a very thin paint across a very large space, right? Or you can like create a very small space and have lots of layers of paint, right? Which then can react in so much more depth to the player's behaviors. And at least as you, every kind of game in the universe is true. And anytime you say something is always going to be a contrary point. But my belief is that players react better to seeing their reaction on a world rather than a scale of the world, right? An incredible game can take place in a single room that is highly reactive to what you do in that room versus wandering around a city, which you have no impact on. There's no agency in, I think would be a lot less emotionally rewarding to the player.
Yeah, you have this time to interest that happens, right? And when everything's close to you in the environment, the time is comparatively instant. Like if you think about escape rooms, I don't think they would be better if they were escape warehouses. Where
yeah, exactly.
We're too far apart. And I think if there's one piece of advice that I try to take over and over and over again is just scope down, like keep it small. You talk about like you got that bucket of paint, use it, like start with something small so that you can finish it, because you learn so much more by finishing something small than you do by shelving something big.
If people are watching other shows on the series, this is a recurring theme. Yeah. Every time we talk about it, because it is so natural to make things big and to want to make things big, but the answer is always to make them small. I taught at USC and at UW on game design, and I would lecture this to my class about keep it small, and then they go off and start to work on their projects, and they had to come back and pitch what project they wanted to build. And inevitably, half the class comes in with, Well, it's kind of like Destiny, only a little bigger.
Right. I do it too.
Exactly. We all do it.
Like this is and then there's this and there's this and there's this and there's this and I think that's just a truism about game development is like I think if when you're first starting out you think the killer idea is the thing. And as you go through you start to realize like the killer ideas are pretty cheap to come by. It's finding the right intersection of just a few of them that make something way bigger and feel way bigger.
This episode of The Game Mechanics was brought to you by Adventure Forge, an all-in-one toolkit for crafting story-rich games for the PC and Mac. Create branching narratives, asymmetric RPGs, puzzle games, and much more. No coding required, no syntax, just smart logic written in plain English. You don't need permission, you don't need credentials, you just need a story, a spark, a reason. Build the game only you can make.
Picking up on your theme earlier of the key in the door,
Right.
is a simple puzzle. And I love the advice of being very, very obvious as much as possible. Now let's take that to the next step in terms of thinking about a larger kind of structure of quest design, right? And how quest design fits within the overall kind of loop that you're trying to do. And there's lots of different ways to achieve this, right? But any kind of guidance in your thoughts about how you kind of merge individual mission or quest design into the larger arc of the overall game.
Yeah, I mean, I think at this point, this is where it really becomes individualized to who you want to be as a game maker and what you want to take sort of the driver's seat in your game. Like everybody's in the car, but who's in the driver's seat? And for some people, it's really about telling a story. For some people, it's much more about giving players agency, right? Like I can answer differently to this character and get a different response. There's multiple ways to solve this. Probably the biggest example of it would be like Breath of the Wild, where it's like, here you go, here's 5 tools, interact with the world how you see fit, and you don't have to solve our puzzles the way that you want to. First, you have to decide what's important to you, and then the structure of the game will start to reveal itself, and the importance of things like how important is it for the player to advance to the next room with that key and that door. For some people, it's really important that the game be challenging, and I think a lot of people want their game to be played and enjoyed, and I think deciding all of those things for yourself, your goals, your pillars of what type of game you're going to make, sets you up then to say like, okay, how hard is it to find this key? Do I have to, or do I want to add an objective to the player that says something like, you need to find the key? Some games do, and some games don't.
Don't beat around the bush, just like say,
find the key. Yeah, just put up a UI element that says like, or like a lot of times you'll hear characters in voice acted things or even in text-based things who tell you like, oh, I need to find that key. Like it's in the player character's voice, but they're still saying that, or else a quest giver saying that. Setting all of that up, again, I would, especially like if you're getting started or if it's your first time trying to do something like this, I would err on the side of just communicating with the player. Unless it's just really important. Like there's Bennett Foddy's Getting Over It, which is like a game that's meant to just basically fill you with rage every step of the way. If you bring them forward, draw them in, and use the tools that are available to you to sort of give the player that sense of going forward. And I think the other thing that we haven't talked about too much about environmental storytelling is sort of the texture and the why of why do I have to find this key? Is there somebody I need to rescue? Is there a mystery that needs to be solved that happened a long time ago? But those things really matter because I think at the end of the day, as game makers, we're show people. We want smoke and mirrors. It's to surprise and delight. And so knowing why I'm doing these things or having that kind of sense can be really powerful to adding to the texture and the feeling, the great feeling of when the key goes into the lock in your part of the game.
Yeah, I'm really glad that you brought that up, the why, because I think environment and level design has a huge impact on the why. You shouldn't just assume that the why comes from a mission briefing. It comes from narration. For that to be more emotional impact and to be more discovered, right? I've always felt for gameplay, anything you discover has more impact than anything you're told, right? And so you want to move as much. I mean, the old screenwriting adage is show, don't tell, right? And I think the game adage is don't show, do. Right?
Yeah.
And so anything you can move from showing or telling the player to them doing it themselves, I think has bigger kind of impact. And environment and level design, obviously mechanics, have a huge impact on that, both to provide the why and the how. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one thing that you said to me pretty early on in our relationship was like, this is the medium, like in the same way that books defined the types of stories that were going to be told for the next 500 years, or films changed the sort of the key element of gameplay that we have that no other medium has. And film tries every once in a while, they try to make interactive stories or something like that, where you can kind of occasionally click.
Yeah, a branch. Yeah.
Yeah, but that interactivity where the player's in control, that's us. Like, that's a unique thing about you. When you decide to sit down and make a game, you get a chance to have that conversation with the player. And the more choice you give to the player, and the more that they find stuff, that just it's a key element of just making a game, and it's what makes it special. What makes it the sort of 21st century version of the film, where the great robbery people were jumping out of their seats.
Right.
When the train was coming at them because they didn't know. I don't know if that's strictly true, but like, we're in the great train robbery part of that time period with this medium.
Video games are 40 years old, 50 years old.
Yeah.
It's a really new format, and we're still learning huge amounts about how to make them and the kinds of interaction. It is, and as you said, I love that phrase, that what is the conversation with the player? Unlike linear media, where the player experiences in exact order and the way that you've dictated it, right? Whether you wrote it or you directed it, here it is that conversation, right? You've shared control with the player. And as we said, setting expectations for what level of control and where that goes is really important, because you don't want the better you set those expectations in the beginning, the less disappointment there is later. Level design and environment design is a big part of setting those, right? It's like creating the bowling alley. Does a bowling alley have the bumpers up, or does a bowling alley have sheer cliffs on the edge of it? But how do you define and set the expectations of where the kind of interactive space for the player, where they get to exercise control, and where you have to be able to limit their control?
Absolutely. You get so many ways to influence how they're going to experience things. I think a lot about, like, it's very important in, like, I say, a From Software game like Elden Ring, that pretty early on in the game, as a player, you get punched in the teeth, and it's like, you can't get past this. You've hit a wall, because that's the contract that you're signing with the player. They're saying, like, this is what you're signing up for, like, and like, we all shake hands and we get into it. But there's also really subtle things, like those Sunless Sea games that are very, like, where just the word choice, it's very ornate and Victorian and very flowering, and I guess steampunky is maybe a word to use, like, where it feels very gilded. Those are part of the contract too, because you're stepping into sort of a time machine, like H.G. Wells or a world, and just those little things that you do help the player understand how they're going to interact with things, and they set off the imagination. And even like a wordless game like Journey, where it's like, this is just going to be very, very beautiful and reflective. And you get that from everything that happens in it. And the player then can come to it with a, like, I'm going to be a Victorian scholar, or I'm going to, like, what is the meaning of life? I guess is kind of like the question in Journey. And so, but they get to do your world. They get to see your world with your glasses on.
I immediately jumped to the opposite extreme, thinking about what if it was a word only game, right? And mixing your two examples together with like the Victorian language, and thinking about the example you did with the hallway, and do that in a word only game where the words change subtly.
Oh my
God. You walk in and it's like, oh, there's a bright light start in room, and you walk in next time and it's like, now you don't go jump right to there's blood splattered, right? You jump to, it's like, you're like, a dimly lit a room with subtle shadows in the corners, right? And because you can take advantage of what we used to call the infinite resolution renderer of the player's imagination. There's a lot of power in anything from all words to no words and everything in between. They're all tools for you to use.
And words are so fast and they're so powerful. Big fan of Disco Elysium. Right off the bat, it sets you up with this like really like witty, smart, funny. What drew me in wasn't the art is great, but that game as text is just, there's a moment where it's like there's just a bunch of tiny little apes crawling around this giant ball in space or something like that, and you can ask how big is the ball, and it's like, oh, it's too big, like you can't even comprehend how big it is. You can ask them how small are the apes, and they're like, they're tiny, they're worthless. And it's just like, it's funny, it's smart, you're clicking on it, you're doing that, and it's magic through words. We've seen it with games that go back to pixel art. You have so many tools that are for you. So find the one that where the work is fun. I'm a big believer in momentum. If you can move fast, it feels good. And I play plenty of like Twine games and stuff like that just blow my mind with their cleverness.
Well, Chris, this has been fantastic. I really appreciate it. Any last bits of advice to people just starting out on this journey and making their games?
Beyond scope down. Keep it small. One of the things that we like to say is one gold medal. One thing that just is really, really special. Like it makes such a difference, and you don't need 35 silver medals or 50 bronze medals, especially if you're small, if you're working by yourself or just with a team. Come up with one really great thing. Like as we were talking, I was thinking about this, and I do not have the name of it in front of me, but like there's a text-based game where everything's made out of food and all you're doing is just going around and eating characters or eating like walls. And it's just like that one idea sticks in my head so much, even though it's all text-based, and I played it maybe 3 or 4 years ago or something. So find that one gold medal would be my advice, and maybe try to cut away as much of the other stuff as you can so that you can just really make that gold medal shine.
Awesome. Great advice. Thank you again for all your time and for the incredible work you've been doing in games, and look forward to talking soon.
Thanks so much for having me, Jordan. It's been great.